Hello, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thank you for joining me for this IPA talk, and I'm grateful to have with me a return guest here for this IPA talk, Dr. Arturo Senteno, who is principal at West Leyden High School. So before Arturo, we had you on after you won AP of the Year a couple of years ago now, and you've had a lot of activity in your life since then. I mean, you've like had a child, you've got your doctorate done, you got a new principal position here at West Leyden, after several years of great leadership at Elk Grove Village High School and all of that. So congratulations on all of it. But that's a truckload of life change in a pretty short period of time, man.
Yeah. I figure, what's more just adding one more spinning plate, right?
Yeah, after a while, I'm not even sure you can recognize it. You just keep it all going and away you go. Well, obviously, congratulations on all of those things. But, our purpose for this IPA talk is to talk about your dissertation study. So, of course, congrats on earning your doctorate degree. That's not a small feat. And before we wrap up, maybe we'll save this to the end. I always, when I'm talking with individuals about their studies, and we're doing one of these IPA talks, I always want to get people's perspective and love to hear yours with regards to what helped get you through it, right? Because it's a bit of a grind and can be and all of that. So I definitely want to hear your thoughts a little bit about that, especially with all these other big life things in play that you had going on. But I am, when I heard actually during our last IPA talk, and I know, you sit on the IPA board, so we have an opportunity to connect every once in a while. But when I heard about this study that you were doing, I'm thinking about that in terms of the issues we're dealing with the teacher pipeline, the educator pipeline overall. I knew this was an important topic that we needed to spend some time talking about. And once the results and everything were in, wanted to hear about the learning that you received, from the study, and want to share that with others. So let's just get right into it with regards to this dissertation topic. Just tell us what it is. Tell us, what it is that you were trying to accomplish with your research.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for having me here. So the title of the dissertation sounds a little more formal, but I'll get into why I picked this.
They always do sound formal.
Right? Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Uh-huh.
The title is Retaining Los Maestros, Exploring the Working Relationship and Role of Principal in Support of Latinx Teachers. And so it's a mouthful, but the reason why I chose that is really looking at teacher retention. And I think looking specifically at teachers of color's retention and how that's impacted, nationally in the state and even locally. I want to make sure that we're looking at studies that really look at how do we keep Latinx teachers in the classroom, because our demographics are shifting towards that in Illinois.
Meaning our student demographics,
right? Student demographics, that's right. So originally I started in this doctoral program, and I started to think about teacher and student match demographics. And there's some studies that were put out a number of years ago. I think in 2016, there was a big study. Johns Hopkins University talked a little bit about what the college attainment rate and success was for any kids that were African-American that had a Black teacher in their education career. Like, it increased dramatically versus not having any Black educators or teachers in their career, in their education career. So I thought that was interesting. I tried to look for research if that study was kind of was duplicated with Latinx, and it wasn't. And so I felt like there was a little bit of a gap there, which I thought was awesome. But that study got me thinking, what happens if you think about leveling up with teachers and their administrators, and in most cases, it's their principals, a direct supervisor. Although, if you look at other bigger schools, they might have a department chair or an assistant principal, but I kept it to a principal because that kind of universally is the admin in charge. And so I looked at, hey, what happens in retention rates for teachers if they have a principal that looks like them, if that demographic matches. So in doing some research with teacher retention, I realized that it's not just necessarily about demographics because there's such a minimal amount of administrators of color. It's hard to really find that, which, is a whole nother issue. But I wanted to take a look at that further. And I realized that there's a lot of research on teacher retention and job satisfaction. And that led me down the road of what makes people motivated or excited about work.
And
So
I'm guessing, Arturo, what you found is the principal or the leader, right? I mean, and this is probably across all different types of both public, private sectors, but that school leader or the leader of the organization is pretty critical when it comes to retention.
Absolutely. And it's really founded in some of the theory of self-determination theory. And what I found was that leaders that utilize that type of theory framework really are a little more successful in getting people feel intrinsically motivated. And so the brief, 5-second recap of self-determination theory is that there's 3 pillars that really constitute and really support job satisfaction and intrinsic motivation. One of them being autonomy. When you give workers or other people autonomy to make decisions, they feel good. They like that. The second one is a sense of competence. You make people feel like they're competent in what they do, that they're successful and that they're knowledgeable. That's good. And then the third part is belonging. When you give them a sense of belonging in the workplace, you add all those things up and it increases intrinsic motivation. And that's the research done from Ryan and Desi. They did that in like the late 80s, early 2000s, a lot of research there. And that makes sense, right? You think about any boss that you ever had, they give you those 3 things, you feel good about coming to work.
Well, if there's a book Daniel Pink wrote called Drive, that highlights some of those things that you just spoke to. And it's a great book, great read. And I think he also references some of that research that you just described right there as well.
So I think that's a critical part. I also know just from my experiences being an educational leader that trust also is a factor that's in there. And that's one of the things I think is maybe a missing component of self-determination theory. So I looked at trust theory, relational trust theory, and I coupled those 2 together as a framework for this dissertation. I said, hey, let me look at these 2 ideas together, self-determination theory and trust, and try to figure out how they're related to each other and what that needs to happen to make people feel satisfied and ultimately keep really good teachers teaching. So the long and short of it, I did a qualitative study. I interviewed 9 teachers and 3 principals. And so how I picked that, I picked 3 high school sites in the Chicago suburban area, kind of explore their demographics. Of the 3 teachers, so it's 3 teachers and a principal at each site. I replicated that 3 times. And I looked for 2 Latinx teachers, 1 non-Latinx, and then I also noted the demographics of the principal. And just coincidentally, in a good way, I found 2 high schools to have a Latinx principal and 1 to have a non-Latinx principal, and it could do all this comparative analysis. So the long and short was I was able to kind of, ask them a bunch of questions, do all the transcripting and analysis, and kind of came up with some themes that I think are important to know if you're a principal looking to support teachers of color, specifically Latinx teachers. Here's some things that might help you with teacher retention and job satisfaction.
So let me just ask you, Arturo, this is maybe just more from a process perspective for those, just thinking about doing dissertation work and such. Since we're into it just a little bit with the qualitative study, how did that go for you? You talk about the transcripting, the coding, all of that. I mean, that's not for the faint of heart. I did a quantitative study on purpose. I mean, that has its nuances and difficulties as well, but I'm like, I just want to put that data in an Excel spreadsheet, let that do the work for me. So, because you've got all of the transcribing and the coding to do. But I'm curious about too, just finding your sample to work with. Did you find that challenging at all, being able to identify, those individuals and getting what you wanted out of that, and also just having people that were willing to do the study with you? I'm just kind of curious how that went for you before we get into the results.
Yeah, so I think I chose a qualitative study because I actually, in one of my qualitative classes, the chance to interview somebody and talk to people about their lived experience, I think is the coolest thing ever. Maybe I'm a storyteller fanatic at heart, but I really like when people tell me their stories. And so for me, yes, it was more work in terms of transcribing everything, coding it. There's a lot of cool technology with transcriptions now where, you can do this a lot quicker than the old school days of
even Zoom, right? I mean,
with Zoom as well.
Just here, you've got that, and it's not perfect, so you got to still go through and clean some things up, but that does help.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of helped along the way to make my decision to go with the qualitative. But because it could have been a quantitative as well, or mixed methods if I added survey data in.
Right.
And so I stuck with this because I think that when you get to some of these personal type of questions, when you ask people about the lived experience, having another person to bounce ideas off of might be more fruitful. And so I felt like this was a little bit of a better method. I also know that my own identity coming to this might bring a different flavor, right? Like I mentioned prior, there's not a whole bunch of Latinx administrators,
Right.
but one who's interviewing might get something out of it differently. And part of this whole research also stemmed from something that I saw in my own workplace, where as I moved through different administrative roles, I noticed that there were other Latinx staff that kind of jumped on board in the department I was at, right? And then if I left in an organization, they seem to leave as well. Maybe not follow me, but they could find other roles.
Right.
So there's something about having a relationship with your supervisor that I think is super important to be aware, first of all, of your supervisor, but also to name it so that we can figure out what that is. And if there is not a demographic match, you can still be successful in holding people in that job role if you don't even look like them.
Right. Right. Well, which is super critical, especially as you look at the student demographic changes that are occurring, right? And just when you look at the pipeline issues and everything that we're dealing with across the board, so we've kind of got two factors here that are feeding into this issue, which is why I think this research is so important. So let's go through some of the critical themes and learnings that you had, Arturo.
Yeah.
What did you gather up from the data that you found?
Yeah, I mean, some of these things are no-brainers, right? Like I think when you hear them, you're gonna be like, yeah, that makes sense.
Right.
And that's good, but I also think that's in our buckets of, yes, we have to make sure we do this. So the first thing that kind of popped out when I was asking everybody questions was really that task delegation is a way principals can really support autonomy. And so being able to task out or delegate tasks to people and be mindful of who you're delegating tasks to is super important. When I ask people, have you ever been part of an initiative? Have you ever led something? The people who have said yes felt a stronger connection to their principal because they were asked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's super important to think about. When we have committees that are open, is it something as easy as sending out a Google form, an open invitation, or do I go shoulder tap somebody and say, hey, look, I notice you have these skills. I want you on this team.
Right.
I think the latter is really the important part.
Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned, and this may or may not be the right spot to bring this up, Arturo, and so if it comes more into play later, we can take it there. But and I might even be using the term the right way, but you talked about tokenism in the findings as well.
Yeah.
And so that explanation about for delegation or whatever is pretty important that people understand. Hey, I'm not putting you on this committee just because of your Latinx background, right? Like that might be part of it, but it also is really important to understand, like you talked about, skill sets, talents, and the rationale for making sure that people have clarity around that, and that it's not just making sure we have a teacher of color or whatever in a seat just to say that we've checked that box, right?
Yeah, and I mentioned that as a nuance to this particular theme is that principals should proceed with intentionality and purpose, right? That there has to be thought. When I interviewed all of the Latinx teachers, they talked about being on committees that were non-instructional or curriculum, like the discipline committee or the safety committee, or right. When I asked the non-Latinx teachers, I got a different answer. And so I think that's worth noting. And are we contributing to sometimes these stereotypes and tropes unintentionally? And so I think that's why I said with intentionality, make sure if you're asking someone to join a committee that, you're asking them for the right reasons, even if it's not something that comes right at the forefront. Just give it some serious thought.
You bet. What else?
So theme 2 was recognizing culture identity develops belonging. That makes sense too, right? Like we should recognize culture and identity. There was a certain type of response I got from teachers when they talked about their principals and how they approach diversity within the building. And so what I found was that when it's recognized, when principals take the opportunity to recognize different types of ethnic groups or diversity of any nature within the building, that's recognized by our Latinx staff in a very strong way, even if it's not said. And I think that's kind of cool. In my study, I told you I interviewed 2 Latinx principals and 1 non-Latinx. It's interesting because the non-Latinx principal actually did a better job at this and got greater buy-in from their Latinx teachers in that school.
Interesting.
So we'll find out that it doesn't really matter all that much, the demographics of the principal. It's the practices in which they do that make them feel welcomed for the teachers of color. I thought that's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. About community building, creating belonging,
Yep.
those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. And I think that's cool to note. I actually have a little bit of a caveat in here because there was something unique that occurred within the study. There was one school in particular, the Latinx teachers did not trust their Latinx principal. And part of it gets into this culture piece where they themselves felt that possibly the principal didn't rise to the cultural expectations that they thought he should. That's fascinating. That's a whole nother research itself. That like he wasn't Latino enough, that he was acting more what they call like white. Those are all words that were from the transcript there. I found that fascinating that there's even within, if you have a shared demographic, that there's some expectations that go along with it.
Yeah, and what makes some of that difficult, Arturo, is it's I don't know, in terms of expectations and whether those expectations are fair or not, either, just based on who the person is and everything. I mean, you talk about that being a whole nother study. I mean, there's a lot of depth we could get into in psychoanalyzing that, which I'm not a psychologist by any stretch, but I think as leaders, we do have to be mindful of that, of what are the expectations that are laid upon us, and doing what we need to be doing to not necessarily do more, but just try to be in relationship with people so they have understanding of why we choose to do what we do, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think another thing that emerged was developing spaces for collaboration. So collaboration, a whole bunch of different levels. Bringing the staff together as much as possible helps. There were stories about like, well, we got together as a department, or when we get together at schools, we really like that. Institute days, I'm thinking of stuff like that, or there are no brainers. But they also talked about can schools develop affinity spaces based on different characteristics. And I thought that was an interesting suggestion. When there were 2 schools that did that, the teachers favored it very high. All teachers did. They liked being able to collaborate with their colleagues, maybe in different ways that they normally wouldn't. But it was kind of it was brought up and suggested by the leader. So that was favored.
Well, one of the things I read in Arturo, you talked about from an interview from one of the teachers, is them just having time to meet with another Latinx teacher quietly in their own space, privately, and then being able to speak, in native language or whatever. And that was really important for them to be able to do that.
Yeah. I think it's honoring that space. And again, you don't have to be the same demographics as the person you're honoring, but you're giving them the space to do that. I think is really powerful. This next one was one that resonated as one of those, this makes sense. Why doesn't everybody do it? But it was interesting to see that maybe it isn't always felt by it. So this theme was feeling heard and following through are critical in creating trust. There were countless stories about how much they trusted their principal in all of their lived experiences based on if they were heard, like there's not multitasking going on, right? Which it's amazing to see that does happen. Or the second part is the follow through. So there were a couple stories where teachers went through a traumatic event. The principal followed through it, maybe a text, or maybe they called at 5 o'clock to, make sure that they're home safe and everything's going okay. That meant a lot, and that built a lot of social capital, which I thought was great.
And what's interesting, we're just talking about really smart leadership practices here across the board, right?
Right.
Like treating people as people and just making sure folks are okay.
Yeah. But I think it's important that we are getting reminded through studies like this, that like these are opportunities for us to develop social capital that is really important to teachers. It makes them want to stick around.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one thing that I really picked up on reading through the study, Arturo, was the personal motivation piece, and what it is that really gets people jazzed up about coming to school every day and even thinking about why they got into the business to begin with. So would you mind talking about that just a little bit?
Yeah, so that was like an emergent theme that came up when interviewing teachers. I found that the Latinx teachers had always talked about, like a question as an example. I'd ask, what's your favorite thing about coming to work? They all responded with the students. The students are the favorite thing. I think there was a teacher who talked about my babies. My babies are the reason why I come here. And that was really highlighted and almost universal through all the Latinx teachers. When I asked non-Latinx teachers, there was a sense of collegiality. Like, I come here because my department's great, or I love working with this curriculum team. They're like my best friends. I had someone stand up in my wedding that's like a co-teacher of mine. So there was a different sense of that. And I think what's important to know about all of that is that as a leader, if you know why they're excited about coming to work, then you use that to foster more positivity and more opportunities for belonging.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's good information for us to have available to us. As I was looking through the study, Arturo, what I also liked, and I'm sure this was part of the expectation for you in completing your dissertation, was just some of the additional artifacts that you created and providing, some, I don't know, I guess in the document it was kind of called as lesson plans, but even just things that school leaders or individuals could be doing, to be thinking about what it is that they're doing in their school to help be supportive of their Latinx team members, or just even more broadly, anyone else in their school overall. Can you talk a little bit about and I'm even thinking about what we could pull in to interject into some of the IPA tools and resources that we've got too. I just thought they were really, really well done and thoughtful.
Yeah. So and maybe this is a plug for NIU, for anybody who's out there looking at a program, but they allow, in addition to the traditional 5-chapter dissertation, they allowed this opportunity where your 5th chapter is actually a product. And I was able to create a couple products. I did a podcast with one of the equity leaders, Shelton Eakin. He does a whole like podcast on equity, and that's kind of his area. So I was able to jump on his podcast and give a little bit of like why supervisors of color matter was kind of the theme there. And so I had the transcription built into there. So that was a nice opportunity to talk about this research. But he also brought some nuances that we haven't talked about and wasn't in here. He said, what happened when you have a small minority of teachers that are Latinx, but you ask them to be on everything, right? Like that's a whole different question, right?
Right.
And so we tackle that in that podcast of what that means. The short of it is asking is really the magic there. They don't have to be on everything, but when you ask them to be a part of it, it's that, hey, I know you can't do this, your plate's full, but I respect what you think. Who do you think I should ask next?
Yeah,
that's important, right? You're giving them that sense of feeling. So that's one product. Another product was a lesson plan that I thought of in terms of maybe like almost an administrator academy type of feel, where we can take in either new principals or principals that are within the first couple of years and give them some of these tools in a way that they learn, so that they're developing great relationships with teachers and reducing teacher turnover. A portion of my research in the Lit Review talks about the damage of teacher turnover causes in education. Not only financially, and I'm preaching to the choir here, but not only financially, but in student learning, there's a lot of research that shows when they get a brand new teacher, how it's different than having a veteran teacher that has some of these practices in place.
Right.
So reducing it is really the goal, and trying to.
Well, I am, that tracks with me on so many levels. Obviously our primary focus has been on school leadership, generally related to churn and attrition and the problems related to that. But it's across the board, and we think about all of the initiatives we try to put in play to help elevate student achievement and improve schools overall. But if we cannot get a handle on the turnover, the churn, the lack of people entering into the profession, all of these other strategies we're trying to deploy are just not going to work.
Right.
And I talk about school leaders, part of the reason you get veteran teachers say this too shall pass, it's because the leaders pass. Hopefully not literally, that might happen occasionally, but it's because they move on, and then the new thing comes in and it's there for 2 years and then it moves on. And you never are able to get any traction related to that. And I'll just roll this up in my own personal experience in a small rural school. I was very fortunate in those core classes in English and math and history and such. Even in my ag classes that I had a couple of core teachers there that were unbelievable, that were with me all the way through. That was one of the benefits of a small school, is I had the same teacher for English 1, 2, and 3, the same math teacher for 5 years. And, when you went in, by the time you were a sophomore, you went in there on day one and you were connected with that person, you were off and running. It's amazing.
Yeah,
it's amazing. So sorry to take us down this road here, but I just want to emphasize the point of what you're saying is so important.
Yeah. And I think that, it all ties together, right? It's job satisfaction, it's teacher retention, it's reducing teacher turnover. All of that's super important if we want success for our students, which is really the ultimate goal.
Absolutely. So Arturo, we'll make sure in the show notes that we've got your contact information there. If people are interested in reading the study, I would definitely recommend that. And I'm guessing we hopefully can see this pop up in some other places, not only in just work that you're doing generally, but also within the association as well. But as I talked about it at the beginning here of our time together, I do want to just talk a little bit more. I know we got into it a bit, but a little bit more just about your experience writing the dissertation overall, just how that went for you and what you did to grind through it and get it done, especially as we talked about earlier, all the other life changes that you had happening at that point in time. It's quite a feat. So any thoughts, recommendations you would give to people as they're heading down this path?
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking like there's two things that resonate. Number one, the best dissertation is a done dissertation.
Yes, I've said that so many times. Yes.
And I think sometimes going into it thinking you're going to write this book that changes the world, this may not be the place for it yet. I say yet because I think there's a lot of opportunities to pursue beyond your dissertation, but like trying to get it done, right, is kind of the ultimate goal. And then something that's passionate to you. I think when you pick a topic that means something to you personally and it's embedded inside, it's not work.
Right.
It's actually kind of enjoyable. So like I said,
and it needs to be, because you're going to be thinking about it. Right. Like for me, as I was getting to the end, I was thinking about it every other thought.
Yes, right. That's right. Every time I was like doing any kind of typing, I was like, oh, this is a good idea. Let me write it down. It was starting to emerge that way. And then just like anything else, you got to dedicate time in your life, actual time to do this work. For me, it was like a Saturday morning when everybody was kind of sleeping and get up a little early. And I would get a few hours to knock it out. And those weekends were times. I know I have friends in our cohort colleague that would basically do it right after work. I couldn't be able to do that. I felt like my brain was too much in other things. So I needed a little bit of time to wake up, refresh. And, and with that being said, it'd take the first 25 minutes of getting stuff together again. Right. But that seemed to work for me.
Yeah. And at least getting something down on paper every time. Right. Just even if it's a sentence.
That's right.
Even if it's a sentence, just to help keep yourself moving forward with that is super important. Well, I'm grateful for your time and being willing to share this out. I'm looking forward to others reading about your research and the good work that you've done, because we need to be mindful of it. Obviously, as we try to encourage individuals into this business and support them when they're here, when you think about who our student population is, we need to be more mindful of our Latinx population, because there is a significant disconnect, right, between the numbers of those kids that we've got and what the current education team core looks like, across the board. So that's critically important. So looking forward to more people engaging with that. So it is a pleasure, because the last time we had this IPA talk, it wasn't Dr. Arturo Senteno, but it is now. So congratulations to you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet. Well, again, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association, again with Dr. Arturo Senteno, who is the principal at West Leyden High School, just wrapping up this outstanding dissertation study. So be sure to check that out. And as always, if there's anything that IPA can do for you, don't hesitate to give us a call or check us out on the web at ilprincipals.org. Take care.